Your brother made my mom disappear." The little girl's voice was barely louder than the courthouse doors closing behind him, yet billionaire Lee Knight stopped as if the words had struck his chest. Reporters shouted his name. Cameras flashed. None of it mattered anymore. 8-year-old Katherine Brooks stood on the courthouse steps clutching a worn, overstuffed folder with both trembling hands. Tears streaked down her face, but she didn't ask for money. She didn't beg for help. "Please," she whispered, "open this before someone takes it." Lee's security team moved toward her, but something in her steady eyes made him hesitate. What could an old folder possibly reveal that an entire courthouse wanted forgotten? If this story touches your heart, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, truth, and hope, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Lee Knight had built his life on evidence. Balance sheets, contracts, audit reports, court rulings. Numbers never cried, and documents never begged for sympathy. They either held up under scrutiny or they fell apart. It was one of the reasons Knight Capital Group had grown into one of the most respected investment firms in America. Investors trusted Lee because he refused to make decisions with his emotions, even when the stakes reached hundreds of millions of dollars. That reputation had followed him into every part of his life, including the moment he walked away from the courthouse with a worn folder resting on the leather seat beside him. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Home, Mr. Knight?" Lee looked down at the folder. The cardboard edges had softened with age. Several corners were repaired with clear tape. A child's careful handwriting labeled each divider in neat block letters. He answered quietly. Yes, the ride back to his estate was unusually silent. Normally, he would spend the drive reviewing emails or preparing for his next meeting. Instead, his eyes kept drifting toward the folder. Not because he believed the little girl's accusation, because of the way she had said it. There had been no anger, no rehearsed speech, no dramatic performance, just fear and certainty. Across town, Katherine Brooks sat inside a modest apartment belonging to her grandmother, Evelyn Brooks. The apartment occupied the second floor of an aging brick building above a neighborhood bakery. The hallway smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. The furniture had been repaired more than once, and nothing matched, but every corner was spotless. Evelyn placed a bowl of warm tomato soup in front of Katherine. "You didn't eat lunch." "I'm not hungry." "You've said that every day this week." Katherine stirred the soup without taking a bite. Her grandmother sat across from her. "Did he take it?" Katherine nodded. "He promised he'd read it." Evelyn sighed. "I hope he actually does." "So do I." Neither of them spoke for several moments. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. Finally, Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed Katherine's small hand. "Your mother always believed that honest people still exist." Katherine stared into the soup. "I just hope we found one." Months earlier, life had been simple. Monica Brooks worked inside the county courthouse as a records specialist. She wasn't a lawyer, she wasn't a judge, she wasn't anyone important in the eyes of the public. Her job was quiet. She maintained archived legal files, organized sealed property records, verified document transfers, and made certain every file returned to the correct storage room. Most people barely noticed she existed. Monica preferred it that way. She loved routines. Every afternoon after Katherine finished school, she would wait inside a small records office until her mother completed work. While Monica filed paperwork, Katherine colored quietly finished homework or helped place colored tabs onto folders. "You have the neatest hands," Monica often laughed. "You mean neat handwriting?" "No," Monica smiled. "I mean your hands are patient." Katherine never forgot those words. She remembered carefully arranging labels while her mother checked inventory numbers. She remembered Monica teaching her never to force papers into crowded folders. "If you rush," Monica would say, "important things get bent." At 8 years old, Katherine didn't understand that her mother was talking about more than paper. Then, 4 months earlier, everything changed. Monica failed to pick Katherine up after school. At first, everyone assumed she had been delayed. Then hours passed. Police searched. Friends called hospitals. Co-workers checked every office inside the courthouse. Her purse remained inside her desk. Her coat still hung on the office hook. Her coffee mug sat half full beside unfinished paperwork, but Monica Brooks was gone. The official investigation found no signs of violence, no ransom demand, no confirmed witnesses. After several weeks, whispers quietly replaced concern. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she couldn't handle raising a child alone. Maybe debt overwhelmed her. Maybe she wanted a fresh start. Katherine hated those conversations. She knew her mother better than anyone. Monica would never leave without saying goodbye. Never. 3 days before disappearing, Monica had done something unusual. She'd come home carrying a thick courthouse folder. She almost never brought work home. That evening, she sat beside Katherine on the couch instead of cooking dinner immediately. Her face looked tired, not frightened, just heavy. "Katie." She always called her Katie. "If something strange ever happens." Katherine looked up from her drawing. "What kind of strange?" "The kind grown-ups don't always understand right away." Katherine frowned. Monica smiled softly. "You don't have to understand everything." She reached into the folder. "If I can't explain someday." She placed several papers into a separate worn folder. "Take this." Katherine giggled. "You're acting silly." "I know. But promise me." "I promise." "If people don't listen—" Monica hesitated. "Find someone whose eyes still slow down when people are talking." Katherine blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means some people listen because they have to." She gently touched Katherine's forehead. "But a few people still listen because they care." Monica looked toward the apartment window. "I hope you never need to know the difference." Lee reached his estate just before sunset. The mansion overlooked rolling green hills beyond the city limits. Its stone walls, perfectly trimmed hedges, and long circular driveway reflected decades of success. Employees greeted him at the entrance. His house manager informed him that dinner would be served in 45 minutes. His executive assistant reminded him of tomorrow's board meeting. His chef asked whether he preferred salmon or steak. Lee answered automatically, yet his attention never left the worn folder under his arm. Inside his private study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded polished walnut walls. The room smelled faintly of leather and cedar. He placed the folder on his desk. For several minutes he simply looked at it. A child's handwriting covered the front. "For Mr. Lee Knight. Please read everything, even if you think I'm wrong." He leaned back. His younger brother, Grant Knight, had handled legal matters for both the family and several charitable foundations for nearly 15 years. Grant was admired everywhere. Elegant, patient, professional. He volunteered at legal aid clinics. He donated generously. He never raised his voice. Lee couldn't remember anyone speaking badly about him. Certainly not a frightened little girl. Still, he remembered Katherine's face. She hadn't looked angry. She had looked terrified that he wouldn't believe her. There was a difference, a very important one. Lee slowly loosened his tie. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the gardens. Inside the silent study, his fingers rested on the worn folder. He could still hear Katherine's quiet voice. "My mom told me. The brother who still looks people in the eyes would believe me." Lee frowned. No one outside the family knew how often people joked that Grant was the charming brother while Lee was the serious one. How could Katherine's mother have known enough to say something so strangely personal? His thumb slipped beneath the first cardboard flap, for the first time all day. Lee Knight opened the folder. The first thing Lee Knight noticed was not the documents. It was the smell. Old paper carried a scent unlike anything produced by modern printers. It held traces of dust, cardboard, ink, and time. Whoever had assembled the folder had handled every page, carefully protecting it from rain, folding none of the corners, repairing tears with thin strips of transparent tape. This was not a collection of random papers. Someone had expected it to survive. Lee settled deeper into the leather chair in his study. A single brass desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the polished walnut surface while the rest of the room faded into quiet shadows. He opened the first divider. Across the top, written in careful block letters with a black marker, were 3 simple words. Start here. Beneath the label rested a handwritten note. Not from a lawyer, not from an investigator. From Katherine. The letters leaned slightly to one side as though she had written them slowly, checking every word. Mr. Knight, my mom said papers don't tell stories unless someone puts them in the right order. I tried my best. Please don't skip pages because some things only make sense later. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. If I'm right, please find my mom. Lee quietly exhaled. Children rarely apologized before asking for help. The note was so simple that it unsettled him. There was no accusation, no demand, only hope. He turned the page. The next section contained copies of courthouse visitor logs. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Rows of dates, identification numbers, names, entry times, exit times. Routine records that thousands of people ignored every year. Someone unfamiliar with courthouse administration would have stopped reading after 30 seconds. Lee almost did. Then he noticed tiny yellow tabs attached to several pages. Each tab carried a short handwritten note. Look again, same day, don't miss this. He followed the first tab. Grant Knight, Visitor Authorization, Restricted Records Division, Tuesday, 10:14. A.M. Lee frowned. That by itself meant very little. Grant occasionally handled legal matters involving confidential property trusts. Accessing restricted records was not unusual. He continued reading. Another yellow tab, Grant Knight, Restricted Records Division, Thursday, 8:47 a.m. Another, Monday. Restricted Archives, another Wednesday. Property Storage Vault. Each visit occurred weeks apart. Perfectly ordinary. Yet Katherine had highlighted only a handful of dates. Why those Lee flipped to the next divider? This section contained parking receipts. He almost laughed. Parking receipts. What could parking receipts possibly prove still? He looked closer. Each receipt showed a courthouse parking garage entry. Each carried the license number of Grant's black sedan. Nothing remarkable, until he compared the dates with his calendar. His expression slowly changed. On 2 of those mornings, Grant had been sitting beside him in executive meetings over 20 miles away. Lee knew because he remembered those meetings vividly. One involved negotiations with overseas investors. Another had lasted nearly 6 hours. Grant had never left the conference room. Or had he? Lee reached toward the drawer beside his desk. Inside sat archived company schedules synchronized with his executive calendar. He searched the first date. Board meeting. Started 11:00 a.m. Grant present. The courthouse parking receipt showed Grant entering at 8:47. Possible. He could have finished courthouse business beforehand. Nothing impossible there. Lee moved to the second highlighted date. Investor Summit. Meeting began at 9:00. Attendance confirmed. The parking receipt recorded Grant entering courthouse parking. 9:18 a.m. Lee blinked. That couldn't happen, not unless the timestamp was wrong. Or the receipt belonged to someone else. He leaned forward. The license plate matched exactly. He checked again. Still the same. His heartbeat slowed. Not from fear, from concentration. There had to be a reasonable explanation. There always was. He opened the next section. Handwritten appointment calendars. Unlike the official visitor logs, these pages belonged to Monica Brooks. Small notes filled nearly every margin. Archive inventory, judge requests, property file transfers, delayed delivery. Everything looked painfully ordinary, until one sentence appeared circled twice. Mr. GK requested sealed file personally. Lee read it again. GK Grant Knight. Another note underneath. Returned after closing hours. No accusation. No explanation. Simply an observation. Lee rubbed his temple. One document could be mistaken. 2 could be coincidence. 3, he wasn't ready to decide. He continued. The next divider surprised him even more. Construction paper. Blue. Folded neatly. Across the top in childish handwriting, "The days I waited for Mom." Inside were tiny drawings. One showed courthouse steps. Another showed a vending machine. Another showed a woman smiling beside shelves filled with boxes. Each drawing carried a date. Lee realized they matched Monica's work schedule. Katherine had apparently spent many afternoons inside the courthouse after school. At the bottom of one page, she had written, "Mom said I should always remember where people walked because people forget, but floors don't." Lee stared at the sentence. Children remembered unusual things, not because they investigated, because they noticed. He suddenly recalled Katherine standing outside the courthouse. She had not spoken like someone inventing a story. She had spoken like someone remembering one. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Grant entered carrying 2 coffee mugs. "I figured you'd still be working." Lee looked up. His younger brother smiled exactly as he always did. Relaxed, confident, perfectly dressed despite the long day. "You know me." Grant placed one mug on the desk. Long hearing today. It was. Grant glanced briefly toward the folder. "What's that?" Lee answered casually. "Something someone gave me outside the courthouse." Grant nodded without much interest. "Happens all the time." "So it does." Grant took a sip of coffee. "I hope it wasn't another investment proposal." Lee smiled faintly. "No." A brief silence settled between them. Grant looked around the study before speaking again. "I actually stopped by the courthouse archives earlier this week." Lee looked up. "You did? Needed copies of some family trust paperwork?" Lee felt something tighten inside him. Earlier this week, the visitor logs inside the folder showed no visit that week. Only older dates. Perhaps Grant meant another courthouse, or perhaps he had simply remembered incorrectly. Neither possibility meant much. Yet Lee noticed himself asking another question. "Did everything go smoothly?" Grant shrugged. "Mostly." "Mostly." "They're reorganizing old records." Lee remained silent. Grant laughed lightly. "You know how government offices are." "I suppose." Another pause. Grant looked at his watch. "I won't keep you." He started toward the door, then stopped. "Oh." He turned back. "If anyone contacts you claiming strange things about courthouse files." His smile remained exactly the same. "They're probably confused." Lee studied him. "What makes you say that?" Grant chuckled. "I've heard rumors lately." "What kind of rumors?" "The usual." He waved dismissively. "People looking for someone to blame." Then he left. The study fell quiet again. Lee stared at the closed door for nearly a full minute. Something about that conversation bothered him. Not what Grant had said, when he had said it. Lee had never mentioned courthouse files, only that someone handed him a folder. So why had Grant immediately connected the two? He looked back toward Katherine's careful notes. One yellow tab remained unopened, smaller than the others, almost hidden. Curious, he lifted the page beneath it. Nothing. He frowned, then noticed the paper felt unusually thick. 2 sheets had been glued together, carefully, deliberately. His fingers separated them just enough to reveal an empty space. Something had once been stored there. A single page now gone. Only faint traces of dried adhesive remained. Someone had removed it, very recently. Lee slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since opening the folder, one thought refused to leave him. If a page had disappeared, who knew it had ever been there? Lee hardly slept. The missing page lingered in his thoughts far longer than the visitor logs or the parking receipts. Those documents might still have innocent explanations. The empty space between the glued sheets did not. Someone had hidden a page there. Someone had removed it. And whoever had done it knew exactly where to look. At 6:30 the next morning, sunlight stretched across the stone terrace outside his study. The estate was already awake. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast. His assistant had sent 3 reminders about investor meetings scheduled for the afternoon. Lee canceled them all. His assistant looked surprised. "You've never canceled a Thursday board review." "I have something more urgent." She hesitated. "Should I inform Mr. Grant?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Lee softened his tone. "I'll tell him myself." By mid-morning, Lee parked 2 blocks away from the county courthouse instead of using the executive entrance. He wanted to arrive unnoticed. People behaved differently when they believed a billionaire wasn't watching. The courthouse looked almost ordinary without television cameras gathered outside. Parents hurried inside holding children's hands. Attorneys balanced coffee cups and thick legal binders. Security officers greeted familiar employees with practiced smiles. Nothing suggested that secrets might be buried beneath the building's orderly routine. Lee entered alone. A young deputy recognized him immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Knight." "Morning. Can we help you?" "I'm actually looking for someone in records." "3rd floor." Lee thanked him and walked toward the elevators. As the doors closed, he noticed someone watching him from the lobby. Katherine. She stood beside a window wearing the same faded navy blue sweater from yesterday, her worn backpack hanging from one shoulder. She wasn't trying to approach him. She simply watched. When their eyes met, she gave the smallest nod, almost as if she already knew why he had returned. The records division occupied a quiet corner of the courthouse that most visitors never saw. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of archive boxes rested in perfect rows. Every shelf carried barcode labels and handwritten section numbers. It smelled faintly of paper cardboard and old air conditioning. A woman in her early 60s looked up from her desk. Silver hair, thin reading glasses, professional posture. Her identification badge read Margaret Ellis, Senior Record Supervisor. She smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Lee introduced himself. "I need some historical archive information." "Regarding which case?" "Actually," he chose his words carefully, "I'm hoping to understand how archived property records are transferred." Margaret relaxed. "General procedures?" "Yes." She stood and walked toward several filing cabinets. "Our process has changed over the years." She explained the movement of sealed files, archive requests, storage procedures, and security protocols with remarkable precision. Everything sounded efficient, orderly, transparent. exactly as Lee expected. Then he asked one simple question. "Did Monica Brooks work under you?" Margaret froze, only for a second, but Lee noticed. The file in her hands stopped moving. Her shoulders stiffened. When she finally looked back, her smile had changed. Smaller. Carefully controlled. "Yes." "How long?" "Almost 11 years. "What kind of employee was she?" Margaret answered immediately. "Very organized." Nothing else. Lee waited. Most supervisors would have added something. Reliable, hardworking, friendly. Instead, Margaret simply adjusted the papers in her hands. Finally, she added, "She kept excellent records." "You knew her as well as co-workers usually do." Lee nodded. "I met her daughter yesterday." Margaret's eyes shifted toward the hallway, only briefly, almost as though checking whether someone might overhear. "Katherine." "Yes." "She's been coming here." "Often," Margaret sighed. "More times than anyone realizes." Lee remained silent. The poor child asks everyone the same question. What question? "Did you see my mom?" The room became very quiet. Margaret looked down at her desk. "I wish I had an answer." "So do I." Lee studied her expression. She seemed genuinely saddened, yet something remained hidden beneath the sadness. Not guilt. Fear. Before leaving, Lee asked another question. "Have any archive boxes gone missing recently?" Margaret looked up too quickly. "What makes you ask?" "Curiosity." She folded her hands together. "Government offices misplace things from time to time. So, yes." She hesitated. "A few boxes required inventory reconciliation." "When?" "Months ago. Shortly after Monica disappeared." Silence. Margaret slowly removed her glasses. "I really shouldn't discuss internal administrative matters." "I understand." Lee thanked her and turned toward the hallway. He had almost reached the elevator when he heard footsteps behind him. "Mr. Knight." He turned. Margaret stood several feet away. Her voice had dropped to little more than a whisper. "If you truly want answers." She glanced both directions down the corridor. "Don't start with the paperwork." "What do you mean?" She swallowed. "Ask what happened the night every security camera stopped recording." Lee frowned. "Cameras? For 43 minutes. Why?" Margaret shook her head. "I've already said too much." She walked away before he could ask another question. Outside the courthouse, Katherine still waited beneath a large oak tree across the street. She immediately recognized the look on Lee's face. "You found something." Lee crossed the sidewalk. "Maybe." "I told you." "You also didn't tell me everything." Katherine lowered her eyes. "I didn't know what was important." Lee sat beside her on the stone bench. For the first time, he noticed how carefully she held her backpack. Not casually, protectively. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "When was the last time you saw your mom?" Katherine answered without hesitation. "At work." "What happened?" "We were putting colored stickers on boxes." "What kind of stickers?" "So people wouldn't lose important files." Lee smiled faintly. "Your mother let you help, only after school." "What happened that day?" Katherine looked toward the courthouse entrance. Mom kept looking at the hallway clock. "Was she worried?" "I think so." "Did she say why?" "No." Katherine paused. "She hugged me longer than normal." Lee felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. "What happened after that?" "My grandma picked me up." "And your mom?" "She said she'd be home after one more meeting." "Did she say who the meeting was with?" Katherine frowned, trying to remember. "No." Another pause. "She only said—" Katherine looked directly at him. "That sometimes nice people smile because they don't want anyone to know they're scared." Lee said nothing. Children often remembered conversations adults dismissed as ordinary. He wondered how many of Monica's words had become meaningful only after she disappeared. As they talked, neither noticed a dark gray sedan parked half a block away. Inside, a man lowered his phone after taking several photographs. One showed Lee speaking with Katherine. Another showed the folder resting beside the little girl. The man typed a short message. He's reading it. Less than 30 seconds later, a reply appeared. Find out what's still inside. The sedan quietly pulled away from the curb. Late that afternoon, Lee returned to his study carrying copies of courthouse maintenance reports he had legally requested through his legal office. Most of the paperwork concerned routine repairs, elevator inspections, electrical maintenance, heating systems, nothing unusual, until one report caught his attention. Security surveillance interruption, duration, 43 minutes, cause listed scheduled system maintenance. Authorized by the signature line had been blacked out in the public copy. Lee stared at the redacted page. Margaret had been right. Someone wanted those 43 minutes forgotten, and somehow, he was beginning to believe Katherine's worn folder was leading him there. Lee placed the maintenance report beside Katherine's folder and read both documents again. 43 minutes. It wasn't a random interruption. The report documented the outage with remarkable precision down to the exact second the surveillance system stopped recording and the exact second it came back online. What it did not explain was why every approval line had been redacted. That bothered him more than the outage itself. Normally, maintenance reports identified supervisors, contractors, and department heads. Transparency protected everyone. Here, the names had vanished. Someone had deliberately erased accountability. Lee reached for his phone. Emily, his executive assistant, answered immediately. Good evening, Mr. Knight. I need every public record connected to courthouse maintenance during the last 12 months. I'll contact our research team. And don't route the request through Grant. There was a brief silence. Of course. Emily had worked for Lee long enough not to ask unnecessary questions. She simply replied, You'll have everything by morning. Lee ended the call. Outside his study windows, dusk settled across the estate. The fountains reflected the fading sky, while lights slowly illuminated the garden paths. Normally, evenings like this brought peace. Tonight, they only sharpened the questions in his mind. Across town, Katherine sat on the living room floor while her grandmother folded laundry. The television played quietly in the background, but neither of them paid attention. Instead, Katherine spread several sheets of notebook paper across the carpet. She was drawing. Not houses, not flowers, a hallway. Evelyn glanced down. You've drawn that hallway 3 times. I keep remembering more. The courthouse. Katherine nodded. There was a light. What kind of light? The yellow one by the old elevator. Evelyn smiled gently. There are probably lots of lights. No, Katherine shook her head. This one buzzed. She mimicked the faint electrical hum. It always made Mom laugh because it sounded like a bee. Evelyn stopped folding towels. What else do you remember? Katherine picked up a blue crayon. I waited on the bench. She carefully colored a rectangle. Then I saw Mr. Grant. You mean Mr. Knight? Yeah. What was he doing? He walked really fast. Katherine frowned. He almost never walked fast. Evelyn looked at her with quiet curiosity. You've seen him before. A lot. How? He came to Mom's office sometimes. Katherine continued drawing. He always smiled. She paused. But not that night. The next morning, Emily entered Lee's office carrying a thick envelope. I gathered everything available. Lee accepted it. What did you find? Very little. She sounded frustrated. The courthouse released only heavily edited maintenance records. Anything else? Emily hesitated. There was one thing. She handed him another document. A guest list. Not exactly. It was a charitable foundation program. A black-tie fundraising gala held at the Riverside Grand Hotel. Date, time, guest speakers, sponsors, attendance photographs. Lee immediately recognized the date. The same evening, the courthouse cameras had gone dark. According to the event program, Grant had been honored for providing pro bono legal services. His keynote speech had begun at 7 o'clock. Lee checked the surveillance report. The camera outage started at 6:18 p.m. It ended at 7:01 p.m. That meant Grant would have needed to travel directly from the courthouse to the hotel. Possible. Very possible. Nothing proved otherwise. Yet something still bothered him. Lee opened the gala photographs. There was Grant, standing beside donors, smiling, accepting applause. Then Lee noticed the timestamp printed beneath one professionally licensed image. 7:26 p.m. He continued scrolling. Another photograph. 7:41 p.m. another. 7:58 p.m. Plenty of evidence showed Grant had attended the gala. None showed when he actually arrived. Lee leaned back. There was still no proof of wrongdoing, only unanswered gaps. Later that afternoon, Lee drove back to the courthouse. This time, Katherine wasn't waiting outside. Instead, Detective Olivia Turner stood near the front entrance speaking with another officer. She recognized Lee immediately. "Mr. Knight." "Detective, I wasn't expecting to see you. I have a few questions." She studied him carefully. "I wondered when someone finally would." They walked toward a quieter courtyard behind the courthouse. Olivia had spent nearly 20 years investigating missing person cases. She carried herself with calm confidence rather than theatrical authority. What can I help you with?" Lee chose his words carefully. "I've been reviewing Monica Brooks' disappearance." Olivia nodded. "I know." "You know, Katherine told me she gave you the folder." Lee wasn't surprised. The little girl seemed determined to keep no secrets from people she trusted. "What did you think of it?" Olivia smiled faintly. "I think Katherine is observant, but observations aren't automatically evidence." Lee appreciated the honesty. "I've discovered inconsistencies." "So did Monica." Lee looked at her. "What do you mean?" Olivia folded her arms. "When Monica first disappeared, I reviewed her work schedule. And nothing looked unusual. So why reopen the file?" "I wanted to." She looked toward the courthouse. "But without evidence, missing person investigations eventually lose resources." Lee remained silent. Olivia continued. "I never believed Monica abandoned her daughter." "What made you think that?" "She left behind everything. Her purse, her medication, her favorite jacket, family photographs, even Katherine's birthday gift." Olivia shook her head. People planning new lives don't leave behind the people they love most. Lee quietly absorbed her words. "What about Grant?" Olivia's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What about him? Did you interview him?" "Briefly." "And?" "He cooperated." "Anything unusual?" Olivia answered carefully. "He was extremely prepared." "What does that mean?" "He remembered exact times." "Isn't that good?" "Sometimes." She looked directly at Lee. "Sometimes people naturally forget small details." Lee understood immediately. Perfect memories could be just as suspicious as poor ones. That evening, Katherine returned to the courthouse after school carrying a small paper bag. She sat beneath the same oak tree where Lee had first seen her. A few minutes later, Lee arrived. "You came back. You asked me to." She smiled faintly. "I brought cookies." Lee laughed quietly. You brought me cookies. My grandma said serious people forget to eat. She handed him one wrapped in wax paper. For the first time since meeting her, Lee smiled without forcing it. Thank your grandmother for me. Katherine watched people entering and leaving the courthouse. After several minutes, she spoke. Can I tell you something? Always. I didn't remember it before. What? The shiny thing. Lee looked at her. What shiny thing? She pointed toward the courthouse entrance. The night Mom disappeared. I was sitting over there. She indicated a stone bench. It was getting dark. Lee listened carefully. I heard footsteps. Whose? I didn't see it first. What happened? The hallway light turned on. The buzzing one. She nodded. And something shiny flashed. What was it? I thought it was a watch. She frowned. But it wasn't. What was it then? Cufflinks. Lee's breathing slowed. Cufflinks. They had little silver horses on them. Lee's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Silver horses. His grandfather had commissioned only 2 identical pairs of those cufflinks nearly 40 years earlier. One pair belonged to Lee. The other belonged to Grant. Katherine continued quietly. I remember because Mom once said they looked expensive. Did you see who was wearing them? Mr. Grant. She looked up. He was walking really fast. Lee said nothing. Children often confuse dates, faces, times. He knew that. Yet this detail felt strangely different. Not because Katherine identified Grant, because she identified something so specific. A design almost no one else would notice. As Lee processed the memory, his phone vibrated. The screen displayed a single incoming message. From Grant. Have you been talking to that little girl? Lee stared at the words. He had never told his brother he planned to meet Katherine again. He had told no one. Slowly, he lifted his eyes toward the courthouse. For the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching both of them. Lee read the message twice before slipping his phone back into his coat pocket. He didn't answer. Across from him, Katherine finished the last bite of the oatmeal cookie her grandmother had packed. She brushed a few crumbs from her sweater and looked toward the courthouse entrance where lawyers hurried down the wide stone steps with briefcases tucked beneath their arms. Did I say something wrong? She asked quietly. Lee shook his head. No. You got that face. What face? The thinking face. Despite everything that had happened, the corner of Lee's mouth lifted slightly. I have a thinking face. My mom used to say people who solve problems always get that face. For a moment, the weight pressing against his shoulders eased. Children had a remarkable way of speaking without realizing how deeply their words landed. My brother just sent me a message. Katherine lowered her eyes. Is he mad? I don't know. She hesitated before asking the question she had clearly been holding back. Does he know you're helping me? Lee answered honestly. I never told him I was. Katherine looked back toward the courthouse. Then, how did he know? Neither of them spoke after that. The silence itself became an answer neither wanted. That evening, Grant Knight arrived at Lee's estate without calling ahead. The brothers had always been close enough that no invitation was necessary. Grant entered through the front hall carrying a bottle of expensive Cabernet. Dinner peace offering, he joked, as one of the house staff accepted the wine. Lee met him in the dining room. You didn't have to bring anything. I know, Grant smiled. I wanted to. The dining room reflected everything people expected from the Knight family. A 20-foot walnut table, tall windows overlooking illuminated gardens, crystal chandeliers, paintings collected over 3 generations. Every detail suggested stability. Every detail suggested trust. Dinner began with ordinary conversation, investment reports, A new children's hospital wing the family foundation planned to fund. An upcoming legal conference in Boston. Grant appeared exactly as he always had. Relaxed, attentive, patient. Anyone watching would have believed they were simply two successful brothers sharing a quiet meal. Halfway through dinner, Lee decided to stop waiting. I visited the courthouse today. Grant set down his fork. Business. No. Grant looked up. Oh. I wanted to learn more about Monica Brooks. For the first time that evening, Grant's smile paused. Only for an instant. Then it returned. The missing records employee? You remember her? Of course. Grant reached for his water glass. Terrible situation. Lee watched him carefully. You met her more than once. Grant nodded. A handful of times. What was your impression? Grant answered without hesitation. Professional. Nothing more. The exact same word Margaret Ellis had used. Professional. Lee noticed it immediately. No one mentioned Monica's warmth, her kindness, her devotion to Katherine. Only her professionalism. Interesting. Lee continued. Katherine believes her mother discovered something. Grant sighed. The poor child. You think she's mistaken? I think she's grieving. Grant folded his napkin neatly. Children often build stories when they're trying to explain painful things. Lee remained quiet. Grant continued gently. I've represented families going through terrible losses. They search for reasons. They connect unrelated events. It's completely understandable. His voice carried genuine compassion, or what sounded remarkably like it. Then Grant added something unexpected. I heard she's been showing people an old folder. Lee looked directly at him. Where did you hear that? Grant blinked. Oh, he smiled lightly. Courthouse gossip spreads quickly. Who told you? I honestly don't remember. Lee didn't answer. Grant laughed softly. You know how rumors work. Do I, Lee thought? Or do rumors sometimes begin with the people who fear them most? After dinner, they moved into the library. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Grant wandered slowly along the bookshelves. You've always kept too many history books. Lee poured 2 cups of coffee. I suppose I have. Grant accepted one. I've been thinking about Katherine. Grant's expression remained sympathetic. If she ever needs financial support, Lee looked up. I'd be happy to arrange something. A trust fund. Private schooling. Counseling. Whatever she needs. Lee studied him. That's generous. Grant nodded. No child should suffer because life treated her unfairly. It sounded perfect, almost too perfect. Lee asked quietly, what if money isn't what she wants? Grant smiled. Then what does she want? She wants answers. Grant looked into his coffee. Sometimes answers don't exist. Another silence settled between them. Lee decided to ask a different question. Where were you the evening Monica disappeared? Grant frowned slightly. We've discussed that before. Humor me. I attended the Riverside Grand Charity Gala. Before that, I finished paperwork at my office. Lee nodded slowly. What time did you leave? Grant answered immediately. 6:15. And you drove straight to the hotel? Yes. No stops? No. Lee watched him carefully. Grant never looked away. Never stumbled, never searched for words. His answers came with remarkable precision, almost rehearsed. Lee changed direction. Margaret Ellis mentioned courthouse archive reorganizations. Grant shrugged. They happen. She also mentioned missing boxes. Grant looked mildly surprised. Did she? She did. Grant took another sip of coffee. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Lee noticed something. Grant had answered every question, except that one. Later that night after Grant left, Lee walked alone through the silent mansion. His father had once told him that people rarely revealed themselves through what they said. They revealed themselves through what they quietly stepped around. Tonight, Grant had stepped around several things. He had never once asked to see Katherine's folder. He had never asked what evidence it contained. Instead, he repeatedly encouraged Lee to see Katherine as a grieving child, rather than someone making observations. That distinction mattered. Very much. The next afternoon, Lee found Katherine sitting in the small public garden beside the courthouse fountain. She was feeding pieces of bread to sparrows. She smiled when she saw him. "I saved some for you. I think the birds would disagree." She giggled softly. Lee sat beside her. "I need to ask you something important." She immediately became serious. "Okay. You told me you saw Grant the night your mother disappeared." "Yeah." "Was that the only time something happened?" Katherine looked down at the water. For several moments she said nothing. Lee didn't interrupt. Finally she whispered, "I didn't tell anybody the other part." "Why not?" "Because..." She twisted the edge of her sweater between her fingers. "Grown-ups already thought I was making things up." "You can tell me." "I'll listen." She looked at him carefully, almost testing whether she believed those words. Then she nodded. "I was hiding." "Hiding where?" "Behind the old file carts." "Why?" "Mom told me not to run around after work." "So you stayed there." She nodded again. "I heard voices." "Whose?" "My mom's. And Mr. Grant's." Lee felt his heartbeat slow. What were they talking about? "I couldn't hear everything." "What did you hear?" Katherine closed her eyes, searching through memory. "Mom said..." She swallowed. "I won't sign something that isn't true." Lee remained completely still. And Grant, he sounded different. Different how? He wasn't yelling. No, he was whispering. Children noticed tone better than words. What did he whisper? Katherine's brow tightened. "I only remember one sentence." She looked directly at Lee. He said, "No one is going to believe a records clerk over me." The fountain continued splashing quietly beside them. People walked past without noticing. A child laughed somewhere across the park. Yet for Lee, every sound seemed suddenly distant. He wasn't shocked because the sentence proved Grant guilty. It didn't. Memory could fail, children could misunderstand, but something about those words felt painfully believable. Grant had always spoken calmly, politely, never loudly. If he threatened someone, Lee realized, he would probably do it in exactly that way, without raising his voice, without attracting attention, with absolute confidence that no one else would hear. As Lee sat in silence, his phone vibrated once more. Another message. From Grant. Only 5 words. "We need to talk tonight." Lee stared at the screen. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure whether he was about to have a conversation with his younger brother or with a man he had never truly known. Lee did not reply to Grant's message. Instead, he slipped the phone into his pocket and remained seated beside Katherine until the last sparrow fluttered away from the courthouse garden. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the stone pathways. Katherine watched the fountain quietly. "Are you going to meet him?" she asked. "Yes." "Were you always close?" Lee nodded. "We lost our parents younger than most people do." Katherine looked at him. "So, he was all you had?" The question landed harder than she intended. Lee looked across the courtyard before answering. "For a long time, yes. Children often understood loneliness without needing long explanations." Katherine simply whispered, "That makes this harder." Lee gave a slow nod. "It does?" That evening, Grant suggested meeting at a private members club overlooking the river instead of the family estate. It was one of the city's oldest buildings with dark oak walls, leather chairs, and large windows reflecting the lights from boats passing below. The dining room was nearly empty. Grant had already ordered coffee by the time Lee arrived. "You sounded serious," Grant said. "I am." Lee sat across from him. Neither man reached for the menu. Grant leaned back comfortably. "I've been thinking about that little girl." Lee remained silent. "I hope you're not letting her carry too much weight in your mind." "What makes you say that?" Grant smiled patiently. "Because that's exactly what frightened children do. They don't lie intentionally. They simply convince themselves that scattered memories fit together." Lee watched his younger brother carefully. Grant's voice remained calm, measured, professional. The same voice juries trusted. The same voice charitable organizations invited to fundraising galas. The same voice television reporters praised whenever they interviewed him about legal reform. "You've spoken to traumatized children before," Lee said. "Hundreds. And you believe Katherine is mistaken." Grant answered without hesitation. "I believe she misses her mother." "Those aren't the same thing." Grant paused. "No, they aren't." Another quiet silence settled over the table. Grant finally asked, "What exactly did she show you?" Lee stirred his untouched coffee. "Why does that matter? I'm concerned. For her, for everyone." Grant folded his hands. "If confidential courthouse records were removed illegally, innocent people could get hurt." Lee looked up. "Interesting." Grant raised an eyebrow. "You assumed confidential records were involved." Grant smiled faintly. "Didn't you say she handed you courthouse paperwork?" "I said she handed me a folder." Grant's fingers stopped moving. Only briefly. Then he relaxed again. "You implied the rest." "Did I?" Grant laughed softly. "I think we're both overthinking this." "Perhaps." But Lee had noticed another small inconsistency. Grant had begun asking increasingly specific questions without waiting for answers. He already seemed to know where the conversation was going. The following morning, Lee drove somewhere he had never expected to visit. The modest suburban neighborhood where Monica Brooks had lived. The small brick duplex looked exactly as Katherine had described. Flower pots lined the front porch. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the roof. Nothing about the home suggested mystery. It suggested ordinary life. A life interrupted. Evelyn Brooks opened the door before Lee could knock twice. She recognized him immediately. "Mr. Knight." "Mrs. Brooks. I wasn't expecting company. I hope I'm not intruding." She smiled politely. "If you're here because of Katherine, I am." "Then please come in." The living room was simple but warm. Family photographs covered one wall. Most featured Monica and Katherine laughing together in parks at school events, birthday parties, and ordinary Sunday afternoons. Lee paused before one photograph. Monica sat on a picnic blanket while Katherine proudly held up a slightly burned marshmallow. Neither noticed the camera. Both looked genuinely happy. "She loved little moments," Evelyn said quietly. Lee turned. "Monica?" Evelyn nodded. She believed ordinary days mattered more than expensive vacations. Lee studied the photographs again. Nothing about Monica suggested someone planning to abandon her child. Everything suggested the opposite. Over tea, Evelyn spoke about her daughter without dramatics. Monica woke early every morning. She packed Katherine's lunch the night before school. She never missed parent-teacher conferences. She loved crossword puzzles. She always sang while washing dishes, though never in tune. She worried too much about bills. She forgot birthdays unless Katherine reminded her. She refused shortcuts at work because little mistakes become big problems. The stories were wonderfully ordinary. Lee found himself listening more carefully than he had expected. People often became idealized after disappearing. Evelyn did not do that. She remembered Monica as human. Kind, sometimes stubborn, sometimes exhausted, always dependable. Did she ever mention Grant? Lee finally asked. Evelyn frowned thoughtfully. Only once. What did she say? She said she searched for the right word. Too polished. Lee looked up. What do you mean? I asked the same thing. What did Monica tell you? Evelyn smiled sadly. She said some people polish silver because they enjoy beautiful things. And others polish silver so no one notices what's underneath. The room became very quiet. While Evelyn prepared more tea, Katherine disappeared into her bedroom. A minute later, she returned carrying a faded blue shoebox. I forgot these. Lee looked inside. Small notebooks, crayons, old-school certificates, nothing unusual, until Katherine handed him a thin spiral notebook with purple covers. My memory book. You kept a journal. She shook her head. Mom made me. Why? So I wouldn't forget days. Lee opened the notebook carefully. Each page contained short entries written in a child's handwriting. Sometimes only one sentence, sometimes a drawing, sometimes both. Most described ordinary afternoons. Mom let me organize blue stickers today. The copy machine made funny noises. Mr. Harris gave me hot chocolate. Mom smiled when I fixed the labels. Then one page caught his attention. Its date matched the week before Monica disappeared. The words were simple. Mr. Grant came again. Mom smiled, but not with her eyes. Lee slowly looked up. When did you write this? That night. Nobody helped you, no. What did you mean? He pointed gently toward the sentence. Not with her eyes. Katherine thought for a moment. You know when grown-ups smile because they want kids to stop worrying? Lee nodded. Mom did that. Was she afraid? I think so. What made you think that? Katherine shrugged. She kept looking at the hallway. Lee stared at the notebook. No adult investigator would have written an observation like that. Only a child would describe fear through someone's eyes instead of their words. And somehow, that made it feel even more believable. Late that afternoon, Lee met Detective Olivia Turner at a neighborhood cafe. She arrived carrying a slim manila folder. I did a little digging. You found something? Maybe. She opened the folder. Several financial records lay inside. These are public filings. Lee studied them. Small, limited liability companies, property management firms, real estate holding groups. Nothing stood out. Look closer. Olivia pointed toward the directors listed on each company. Different names, different addresses, different businesses. So, they all use the same registered legal representative. Lee read the line. Knight Legal Advisory, Grant's law firm. Lee frowned. That doesn't prove misconduct. No, Olivia agreed. It doesn't. She leaned forward. But it tells us one thing. What's that? Grant was connected to far more property transfers than he ever mentioned. Lee looked through the papers again. There are dozens. 48 companies. All different. On paper. Olivia folded her hands. But whoever built this network wanted it to appear unrelated. Lee looked out the cafe window. Rain had begun falling lightly. People hurried past carrying umbrellas. Somewhere across town, Grant was likely finishing another successful workday. Still respected, still admired, still trusted. Lee returned his attention to the folder. One question echoed louder than all the others. If Monica had discovered this network, how much had she actually known before she disappeared? Rain continued falling as Lee drove across the city with Detective Olivia Turner seated beside him. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in steady rhythm, but neither of them spoke for several minutes. The address Olivia had received earlier that morning led far beyond the courthouse district, past aging warehouses and quiet residential streets, toward an older industrial neighborhood that had gradually emptied over the years. Finally, Lee broke the silence. "Who gave you the address?" Olivia kept her eyes on the road ahead. "A retired courthouse maintenance worker." "Can he be trusted?" "I've interviewed him before." "What was his name?" "Harold Benson." Lee nodded. "He worked at the courthouse for nearly 30 years. "And he never mentioned Monica before." Olivia sighed. "He wanted to, but he was afraid." "Afraid of what?" He wouldn't say over the phone. Harold Benson lived in a small white house with peeling paint and an overgrown vegetable garden. A faded American flag hung from the front porch. When Lee and Olivia stepped onto the wooden steps, the elderly man was already waiting. He looked to be in his late 70s. His shoulders had rounded with age, but his sharp gray eyes missed nothing. "You came." Olivia smiled politely. "Thank you for agreeing to see us." Harold looked at Lee. "So, you're the brother?" Lee gave a quiet nod. "I am." Harold studied him for another moment before stepping aside. "Come in." The house smelled of coffee machine oil and old books. Framed photographs covered the hallway. Some showed Harold repairing courthouse heating systems decades earlier. Others showed retirement parties, coworkers, and family gatherings. One picture immediately caught Lee's attention. Monica Brooks stood in the back row of a courthouse staff photograph. She wasn't posing. She was laughing at something happening off camera. Harold noticed him looking. "She laughed like that a lot. You knew her well as anyone knew Monica." Harold sat slowly in an old wooden chair. "She treated janitors the same way she treated judges." Lee understood what he meant. Respect that didn't change depending on someone's job. Harold folded his weathered hands. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." For nearly an hour, Harold spoke about ordinary courthouse life. Broken elevators, leaking pipes, snowstorms, power failures, office gossip. At first, Lee wondered if the old man had simply drifted into memories. Then he realized something. Harold wasn't wandering. He was building context, helping them understand what normal looked like before explaining what wasn't. Finally, Harold leaned forward. "About 6 months before Monica disappeared," he looked directly at Lee, "she started asking unusual questions." "What kind?" "Storage room keys, security schedules, archive transfer logs." Olivia frowned. "Why?" "I asked her that." "And," Harold smiled faintly, "she told me." He paused. "Sometimes the safest place to hide something is where everyone thinks they've already looked." Lee recognized the sentence immediately. It sounded exactly like Monica. Quiet, practical, never dramatic. Harold continued. "One afternoon she handed me a small metal box." "What did she say?" "Keep this somewhere even I can't accidentally find it." Olivia looked surprised. "You never told investigators?" Harold nodded slowly. "I promised her. Even after she disappeared, I kept thinking she'd come back for it." His voice softened. When weeks turned into months, he looked toward the hallway. "I wasn't sure what promise mattered more." Harold stood carefully. "Come with me." They followed him into a detached workshop behind the house. The small building smelled of sawdust and machine grease. Old shelves lined every wall. Toolboxes, paint cans, rusted hardware. Nothing appeared unusual. Harold stopped beside an old wooden workbench. He reached underneath and felt along the lower support beam. A quiet metallic click echoed through the room. Lee hadn't even noticed the hidden compartment. Harold slid out a narrow steel box coated with years of dust. It stayed here the whole time. He placed it gently on the workbench. The box measured no more than 14 inches wide. Its paint had chipped away in places, exposing bare steel beneath. A small brass padlock secured the front. Harold reached into his shirt pocket. "I never used this key." He handed it to Lee. "You should." Lee hesitated before inserting the key. The lock opened with a soft click. Inside lay several carefully wrapped bundles. Each carried Monica's handwriting. "Do not throw away. Check last. Copies." One envelope simply read, "If something happens." Lee carefully removed the contents. Duplicate handwritten notes. Appointment calendars. Photocopies of courthouse transfer requests. A folded courthouse floor map marked with tiny circles in blue ink. Everything had been organized with extraordinary care. Olivia quietly whispered, "She expected someone to erase the originals." Harold nodded. "She said paperwork disappears, but patterns don't." Near the bottom of the box rested a small digital voice recorder. Its batteries had long since died. Harold opened another drawer. "I bought replacements years ago." "You kept them?" "I figured she'd need them." Lee carefully inserted the batteries. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the tiny screen flickered to life. 7 recordings, each labeled only by date. Olivia looked toward Lee. "You should decide." Lee nodded. He selected the earliest recording. Static filled the workshop. Then Monica's voice emerged, calm, professional, almost as though she were dictating office notes. "If anyone ever hears this," a pause, "it means I ran out of safer places to keep the truth." Lee remained completely still. Monica continued, "I am recording observations, not accusations. If I ever become confused, if my notes disappear, I want someone to understand the order in which events happened." The recording ended. No names, no dramatic revelations, only methodical documentation. Olivia immediately understood. She was protecting the chain of evidence. Lee nodded. She wanted facts to survive. The second recording contained similar observations. Dates, office locations, file movement, storage requests. Nothing directly implicated anyone, yet a pattern slowly emerged. Certain sealed property files repeatedly changed storage locations without formal authorization. Each move created small inconsistencies, minor enough to escape casual notice, large enough to concern someone responsible for archive accuracy. The third recording mentioned something new. "I have now documented 17 irregular transfer requests. My supervisor believes they are clerical errors. I no longer agree." Harold quietly lowered his head. "I wish I'd listened harder." Lee pressed play again. The fourth recording ended abruptly after footsteps echoed in the background. Someone opened a door. Monica immediately stopped speaking. The file ended. Nobody else spoke. Still, the silence felt unsettling. By the sixth recording, Monica sounded more tired. Not frightened, exhausted. "I've begun making duplicate copies. I cannot risk keeping everything together. If someone finds one collection, perhaps another will remain." Lee slowly looked around the workshop. The steel box, Katherine's folder, the missing page. Monica hadn't trusted one hiding place. She had created several, like someone assembling pieces of a puzzle she hoped another person would someday finish. Only one recording remained. The longest, nearly 12 minutes. Harold folded his arms. I've never listened. Why not? Olivia asked. It wasn't mine. Lee looked at the screen. For reasons he couldn't explain, his hand hesitated above the play button. He suddenly remembered Katherine's words. My mom told me papers don't tell stories unless someone puts them in the right order. Everything until now had been pieces. Perhaps this recording would finally connect them. He pressed play. Several seconds of silence passed. Then Monica took a slow breath. If you're hearing this, another pause. I couldn't protect these papers any longer. The workshop seemed to grow impossibly quiet. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tin roof. Inside, 3 adults stood frozen, while Monica's voice continued from months earlier, and Lee realized that whatever came next might permanently change everything he believed about both his family and his brother. No one moved. The only sound inside Harold Benson's workshop came from the rain striking the tin roof and the faint hiss of the old voice recorder. Monica took another slow breath before speaking again. If you're hearing this, I couldn't protect these papers any longer. I hope that doesn't mean the truth disappeared with them. Her voice remained steady, not dramatic, not frightened, simply careful. I've spent months documenting irregular property transfers connected to sealed courthouse records. At first, I believed they were clerical mistakes. A brief pause. I was wrong. Lee leaned forward slightly. Olivia took out a notebook but did not write. Neither wanted to miss a single word. I am not accusing anyone based on suspicion. I am recording facts. Every document I copied exists because I verified it more than once. Another pause followed. If someone tells you I stole records, please ask why I spent so much time making copies instead of destroying originals. Lee felt his chest tighten. That single sentence dismantled one of the explanations Grant had offered only days earlier. Grant had insisted Monica stole confidential files, but Monica's own recordings suggested the opposite. She wanted the originals preserved. She only feared they might disappear. The recording continued. I found property transfers affecting families who never realized ownership had changed. The paperwork looked complete. The signatures appeared valid, but supporting archive records no longer matched. I reported the inconsistencies. No investigation followed. Olivia slowly looked toward Lee. Neither of them spoke. Monica had described the very shell companies Olivia had uncovered. Still, she mentioned no names, only facts, only procedure, exactly as someone trained to preserve records would. Then her tone changed almost imperceptibly. I finally understood why. Another pause. Someone with legitimate access could rearrange files without attracting attention. Lee's fingers tightened around the edge of the workbench. The recorder crackled softly. I still don't know everyone involved, but I know enough to realize I should stop working alone. The message ended with several seconds of silence before the recording clicked off. No names, no dramatic accusation. Nothing a defense attorney could easily attack. Harold quietly wiped his eyes. She always thought carefully before speaking. Olivia nodded. That's exactly why this matters. Lee remained staring at the recorder. Monica hadn't tried to convince anyone. She had tried to help whoever came after her verify the truth independently. That realization carried more weight than any emotional plea ever could. They spent another hour examining the documents inside the steel box. Lee spread courthouse maps across the workbench while Olivia compared appointment schedules with public filings. Harold quietly brewed coffee. The deeper they looked, the more a pattern emerged. Certain property files had been transferred repeatedly between archive rooms before eventually disappearing from standard tracking logs. Each transfer involved perfectly valid paperwork. Each authorization looked routine. Each signature appeared authentic. Nothing screamed fraud. Everything whispered it. Olivia circled several dates. Look. Lee followed her finger. The unusual file movements clustered around only a handful of weeks. What happened during these periods? Harold answered from across the room. Large redevelopment projects. Lee looked up. Meaning, old neighborhoods, commercial expansion, condemnation hearings. Families already struggling financially would have found it nearly impossible to challenge complicated legal paperwork, especially if the records themselves no longer matched. Lee slowly understood the scale. This wasn't about one missing person. It wasn't even about one family. Someone had quietly manipulated legal records affecting dozens of ordinary people. And Monica had noticed because she organized the archives every day. As evening approached, Lee drove directly to his downtown office instead of returning home. The top floor overlooked nearly the entire city. Glass walls reflected the fading orange sky while employees quietly finished their work below. Emily entered carrying fresh coffee. You've been unreachable. I know. You have 3 board members asking for updates. They can wait? She nodded. Then she noticed the folders spread across his conference table. I've never seen you cancel this many meetings. Lee looked toward the city skyline. Sometimes numbers aren't the biggest problem. Emily waited. He trusted her judgment. More importantly, he trusted her discretion. I need every property transaction connected to these companies. He handed her Olivia's list. Emily scanned the pages. There are dozens. I know. How far back? 5 years. She looked surprised. That will take time. Take it. Emily gathered the papers. As she reached the door, Lee spoke again. One more thing. She turned. Don't let anyone know what you're researching. Emily understood immediately. Not even Mr. Grant. Lee hesitated only briefly. Not even Grant. Meanwhile, across town, Grant Knight stood inside his elegant law office overlooking the river. A young associate entered carrying several case files. Mr. Knight. Grant barely looked up. Yes, the courthouse requested duplicate authorization records from 3 years ago. Grant slowly removed his reading glasses. Who requested them? I'm not sure. Were names listed? No. Grant remained silent for several seconds. Send me the request. The associate handed him the paperwork. Grant read it carefully. No names, only document numbers. Still, he recognized them immediately. His expression remained composed. When the associate left, Grant quietly locked his office door. He opened a secure cabinet hidden behind framed legal diplomas. Inside rested several neatly labeled binders. Grant removed one. He compared the request with its contents. Then he frowned. One document should have been there. It wasn't. For the first time in many years. Grant looked genuinely unsettled. He closed the cabinet, walked to the window, pulled out his phone. After several rings, someone answered. We have a problem. The voice on the other end remained calm. Grant lowered his own voice. They're asking about the old transfer files. A pause. No. Another pause. I don't think this is routine. Grant looked toward the courthouse visible across the river. I think someone's putting the pieces together. He ended the call. His reflection stared back from the darkening window. The polished attorney everyone admired still looked perfectly composed. Only his eyes had changed. They no longer carried quiet confidence. They carried calculation. The following afternoon, Lee returned to the courthouse to meet Olivia. Before entering, he noticed Katherine sitting on the same stone bench where they had first spoken. She wasn't crying this time. Instead, she was reading a worn library book while swinging her feet gently above the pavement. When she saw him, she smiled. You look tired. I probably am. You found more things. Lee sat beside her. We did. Katherine closed her book. My mom always said the truth gets heavier before it gets lighter. Lee looked at her. She said that when people have to carry it. He nodded slowly. I think she was right. Katherine searched his face. Do you believe me now? The question was so quiet that it almost disappeared beneath the sounds of passing traffic. Lee answered just as quietly. I believe you've been telling me exactly what you remember. She smiled faintly. That's different. It is. You still don't know everything. No. He admitted it. I don't. Katherine looked toward the courthouse doors. Mom said memories aren't enough. You need proof. Lee smiled. Your mother sounds very wise. Katherine grinned. She also said I leave crayons everywhere. The small joke broke the tension between them. For a brief moment, they looked less like a billionaire and a frightened little girl. They looked like two people trying to solve the same impossible puzzle. Then Lee's phone rang. The screen displayed only one name. Grant. Lee answered. Hello? His brother's voice sounded calm as ever. Lee? We need to see each other. When? Tonight. What about? Grant paused. I think it's time I explained why Monica Brooks was asking questions she never should have asked. Lee's expression hardened. It was the first time Grant had ever admitted knowing exactly what Monica had been investigating. And he had done it without realizing what he had just revealed. Lee ended the call without answering. For several seconds, he simply stared at the dark screen of his phone. Across from him, Katherine watched his expression change. What happened? Lee slipped the phone into his jacket. My brother wants to meet. She lowered her eyes. Is that good? I don't know. He sounded different. Lee nodded once. Yes. Katherine looked toward the courthouse. My mom used to say people tell the truth by accident when they're trying too hard not to. Lee thought about Grant's exact words. Monica Brooks was asking questions she never should have asked. Grant hadn't denied knowing Monica. He hadn't claimed ignorance. Without realizing it, he had admitted that Monica's investigation had become personal. That a single sentence wouldn't prove a crime. But it confirmed something Lee could no longer ignore. Grant knew far more than he had admitted. The meeting took place that evening in Lee's private office overlooking the city. Unlike the family estate, the office felt deliberately impersonal. Glass walls, steel beams, minimal furniture. No family photographs, no childhood memories. Just business. Grant arrived exactly on time. He entered carrying no briefcase, no files, only himself. You chose the office, Grant said with a faint smile. I thought neutral ground would be better. Lee gestured toward the conference table. Sit. Grant remained standing for a moment before taking the chair opposite him. Neither brother spoke immediately. The silence stretched long enough that the sounds of distant traffic became noticeable through the thick windows. Finally, Grant folded his hands. I've made mistakes. Lee said nothing. But before you judge me, Grant continued calmly, you deserve context. Lee watched him carefully. I'm listening. Grant leaned back. Monica Brooks was very good at her job. I know. Too good. Lee raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means she started noticing inconsistencies that weren't actually dangerous. Dangerous to whom? To ongoing negotiations. Grant spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex legal matters. Large redevelopment projects involve thousands of moving pieces. Paperwork changes. Ownership structures evolve. Companies merge. People who only see fragments often misunderstand the bigger picture. Lee listened without interrupting. Grant continued. Monica believed every inconsistency meant corruption. She became obsessed. Lee finally spoke. She documented facts. Grant nodded politely. From her perspective. And from yours? My perspective included information she didn't have. Lee remained expressionless. So you confronted her? Grant hesitated. Yes. You argued. We disagreed. You told her no one would believe a records clerk over you. For the first time that evening, Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. Who told you that? Lee did not answer. Grant slowly exhaled. I don't remember using those words. You don't deny the conversation. Grant looked toward the window. I spoke firmly. I never threatened her. Lee studied his younger brother. Grant continued speaking with perfect composure. I wanted her to stop making assumptions. And then she disappeared. Grant met his brother's eyes. Yes. Neither man looked away. Lee quietly opened a folder on the conference table. Not Katherine's, a different one. Inside lay copies of public financial records, courthouse transfer logs, maintenance reports, and Monica's documented observations. He slid several pages across the table. I've spent the last week reading. Grant glanced at the papers. I can see that. I've also been asking questions. I'm sure you have. Lee pointed toward one page. 48 shell companies. Grant looked briefly before pushing the papers back. Perfectly legal. Perhaps. Lee picked up another document. Repeated archive transfers. Administrative. The surveillance outage. Scheduled maintenance. Lee reached for another page. The missing archive boxes. Inventory errors. Grant answered every point without hesitation. Every explanation sounded reasonable, individually, yet together they felt strangely rehearsed. Lee slowly closed the folder. Do you know what troubles me? Grant waited. It's not your answers. It's how quickly you have them. Grant smiled faintly. I'm an attorney. I prepare. I know, Lee nodded, but preparation isn't the same as honesty. For the first time, Grant's smile faded, only slightly. Meanwhile, downstairs in the building lobby, Detective Olivia Turner stepped through the revolving doors. She had not come to arrest anyone. Not yet. Instead, she carried a sealed envelope containing newly verified records obtained earlier that afternoon. Emily met her near the reception desk. Mr. Knight is upstairs. I know. The research team finished faster than expected. Emily handed Olivia another folder. These came in 20 minutes ago. Olivia opened it while walking towards the elevator. Property transfer summaries, corporate registration updates, historic filing confirmations. One page immediately caught her attention. A notarized amendment. The listed legal representative was Grant Knight. The filing date matched one of Monica's handwritten calendar entries. Olivia's heartbeat quickened. It wasn't proof of fraud, but it independently confirmed that Monica's timeline had been accurate, exactly as recorded. She stepped into the elevator. Upstairs, the conversation between the brothers continued. Lee looked directly at Grant. I want to ask you one question. Grant nodded. Go ahead. When Monica disappeared, Lee spoke slowly. Why did you immediately tell investigators she may have taken confidential records? Grant blinked. Because it seemed possible. Based on what? She had access. So did dozens of employees. Grant remained silent. Lee continued. You introduced that theory before anyone found missing documents. Grant's expression remained controlled. It was simply one possibility. No, Lee answered quietly. It wasn't. It became the investigation. Another silence filled the room. Lee stood and walked toward the windows. The city lights shimmered beneath the evening sky. When Mom and Dad died, he said softly, you were 16. I was 20. Grant nodded. You promised we'd always trust each other. I remember. I kept that promise. Lee slowly turned. I don't know if you did. For the first time in years, Grant looked hurt, not offended, not angry, genuinely hurt, or perhaps genuinely convincing. I've spent my entire career protecting this family. I know. I've protected your business. I know. I've protected our reputation. Lee nodded again. I know. Grant took one step forward. So why are you choosing the word of an 8-year-old child over your own brother? Lee answered without raising his voice. I'm not. Grant frowned. I'm choosing evidence. Before Grant could respond, a knock sounded at the office door. Emily entered. Mr. Knight, she looked from one brother to the other. Detective Turner is here. Lee nodded. Please send her in. Grant remained perfectly still. Olivia entered carrying 2 thick folders. She placed them carefully on the conference table. I've received independent confirmation. She opened the first folder. Every document Monica copied matches official filing histories recovered from state archives. Grant's face remained calm. Olivia opened the second folder, and these records establish that the timeline Katherine described aligns with verified courthouse access logs. Lee looked toward Grant. His brother had not spoken for nearly a minute. Finally, Grant drew a slow breath. You think this proves something, Olivia answered evenly. It proves Monica wasn't imagining patterns. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lee noticed it was the first crack in his brother's composure. Not an outburst, not a confession, just one brief moment where complete control slipped away. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city continued as though nothing had changed. Inside, Lee realized the investigation had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a grieving child's story. No longer a collection of curious coincidences. Independent records, separate witnesses, archived filings, Monica's careful notes, Katherine's memories. Each piece had been verified from a different source. The truth was no longer standing on one fragile pillar. It was beginning to stand on many. And for the first time since this journey had begun, Grant Knight looked like a man who understood that even the strongest mask could not survive forever. The room remained silent, long after Detective Olivia Turner closed the second folder. No one rushed to speak. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, reflecting against the conference table, where months of scattered facts had finally begun to form a single, unmistakable picture. Lee Knight looked at his younger brother. Grant sat perfectly still. For years, Lee had admired that composure. He had mistaken calmness for integrity, confidence for honesty. Now, he wasn't so sure. Olivia broke the silence. Mr. Knight, no one here is accusing anyone without evidence. She rested one hand on the folders. But these records establish something important. Lee nodded. What? Monica Brooks's notes were accurate. Grant finally spoke. Accuracy doesn't equal criminal conduct. No, Olivia agreed. It doesn't. She slid another document across the table. But it does mean Monica wasn't inventing irregularities. Grant glanced at the page without touching it. The investigation will determine the rest. His voice remained controlled, measured, professional. Yet Lee noticed something new. Grant no longer sounded confident. He sounded careful. There was a difference, a significant one. Within 48 hours, the county formally reopened its review of the property transfers connected to the courthouse archives. This time, investigators did not rely on a single source. They compared Monica's handwritten notes with the preserved state records. They examined duplicate filing histories stored outside the county. They interviewed retired employees who had never been questioned after Monica disappeared. One by one, forgotten details resurfaced. A courier remembered being asked to deliver sealed boxes after normal business hours. A records technician recalled receiving file requests that bypassed ordinary procedures. An administrative clerk confirmed that several archive transfers had been entered manually instead of through the courthouse's electronic system. Individually, none of those memories proved wrongdoing. Together, they painted a troubling picture. The review expanded, then expanded again. Soon, state investigators joined the inquiry. The questions no longer centered only on Monica Brooks. They centered on every family whose property records had passed through the affected archive system. News of the investigation spread quietly at first. Then, local newspapers began reporting that historical courthouse procedures were under review. No names appeared in the articles. Only facts. Just as Monica would have wanted. Throughout the investigation, Katherine rarely visited the courthouse. Instead, she returned to school. She completed homework. She helped her grandmother water tomato plants on the apartment balcony. She borrowed library books every Saturday. Life slowly regained small routines. Yet, every afternoon she looked toward the apartment window whenever a car stopped outside. Still hoping. Still waiting. One rainy Tuesday evening, someone knocked gently on the apartment door. Evelyn opened it. Detective Olivia Turner stood outside. She smiled softly. "I have someone who'd like to come in." Before Evelyn could answer, another woman stepped into view. She looked thinner than the photographs on the wall. More tired. Her hair had grown longer. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes. But there was no mistaking her. Mom. Katherine froze. The worn storybook slipped from her hands onto the carpet. For one heartbeat, she couldn't move. She simply stared. Then Monica Brooks opened her arms. Katie. That single word shattered months of fear. Katherine ran across the room so quickly that neither Evelyn nor Olivia could stop the tears filling their own eyes. Monica knelt despite obvious exhaustion and wrapped both arms around her daughter. "I'm so sorry." She whispered the words over and over. "I'm so sorry." Katherine buried her face against her mother's shoulder. "I knew you didn't leave." Monica closed her eyes tightly. "I never would." "I knew it. I know you did." Neither spoke for several moments. They simply held each other. The silence said everything words couldn't. Later that evening, Olivia explained only what Katherine needed to know. For Monica's safety and the integrity of the investigation, many details remained confidential. Months earlier, after realizing the scope of the document manipulation, Monica had agreed to cooperate with investigators from outside the county. Because officials feared evidence could disappear, and feared pressure from people connected to the case, they placed her under protected witness status while quietly verifying her records. She had wanted desperately to contact Katherine. She hadn't been allowed. Every request risked exposing the investigation before enough independent evidence had been secured. The separation had protected the case, but it had broken a mother's heart. Monica took Katherine's hands. I counted every birthday candle. I remembered every school day. I imagined every bedtime story. Katherine wiped away fresh tears. I saved your blanket. Monica smiled through her own tears. I hoped you would. Several weeks later, Lee asked Monica and Katherine to meet him one final time. Not inside a courtroom, not in a boardroom. At the courthouse steps where everything had begun. The autumn air carried the first hint of cool weather. People hurried past without recognizing the significance of the ordinary stone staircase. Lee held the worn folder carefully in both hands. The tape remained. The bent corners remained. Katherine smiled. You fixed the loose edge. Lee nodded. I thought it deserved better. He looked at Monica. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I do. He lowered his eyes briefly. I spent my life believing that influence, education, and experience naturally led people toward the truth. He looked at Katherine. Your daughter reminded me that truth doesn't care who discovers it first. Monica smiled gently. She notices things. I've learned that. Lee turned toward Katherine. When you handed me this folder, he lifted it slightly. I almost gave it to one of my assistants. Katherine giggled. I'm glad you didn't. So am I. For the first time in many years, Lee felt no need to hide his emotions. I should have listened sooner. Months later, Lee Knight announced the creation of the Knight Justice Foundation. Unlike many charitable organizations, its purpose wasn't simply financial assistance. The foundation provided legal guidance, document preservation support, and free record reviews for families struggling to understand complicated property issues. Every volunteer received the same reminder during orientation. Never dismiss a question because of the person asking it. Inside the foundation's lobby, displayed in a simple glass case, rested one ordinary worn folder. No expensive artwork surrounded it. No dramatic lighting highlighted it. Only a small bronze plaque. It read, "Truth often arrives quietly. Listen before it disappears." Visitors frequently paused before moving on. Few realized that one frightened little girl had carried that folder across courthouse steps while nearly everyone looked past her. Years later, Katherine sometimes visited the foundation after school. She loved reading in the small library near the entrance. Occasionally, children waiting with their parents would ask about the old folder displayed behind the glass. Katherine never began with billionaires. She never began with investigations. She simply smiled and said, "It belonged to my mom." Then, after a thoughtful pause, she added, "And it taught a lot of grown-ups how to listen." The folder had never been valuable because of the paper inside it. It became valuable because one little girl refused to let anyone convince her that her voice mattered less than someone else's. Sometimes, justice begins with a judge. Sometimes, it begins with an investigator. And sometimes, it begins with an 8-year-old child who quietly says the one sentence everyone else is afraid to hear. Every day, we meet people whose voices are easy to overlook. The child asking one more question, the elderly neighbor who remembers an important detail, the quiet employee who notices something everyone else misses. Too often, we assume wisdom belongs only to those with power, wealth, or titles. But this story reminds us that truth has never cared about status. It only asks for someone willing to listen. Real courage is not speaking the loudest. Sometimes it is holding on to the truth even when no one believes you. Katherine never fought with anger or demanded attention. She simply refused to let go of what she knew in her heart. And Lee's greatest act of leadership was not solving the mystery, it was having the humility to admit he had been wrong and the courage to listen before it was too late. If this story touched you, share where you're watching from and tell us your local time in the comments. Ooh, we'd love to know how far this journey has traveled. And if you believe kindness, honesty, and quiet courage can still change lives, please subscribe and join us for more stories that remind us why listening may be the most powerful thing we ever do.